I'd like to call to order the adjourned meeting of the City Council of the City of Victorville and the City Council sitting as the Library Board of Trustees, Southern California Logistics Rail Authority, Southern California Logistics Airport Authority, Victorville Redevelopment Agency, and the Victorville Water District. Item number 1 is public comment. Anyone wishing to address the council, please come to the podium.
Dorothy Miller, and I feel that this is supposed to be a budget meeting, right?
Yes.
Okay. I have a little problem with the budget. I think we need to sit back and really study this budget and find out exactly where we stand. I believe, now this is my personal feeling, that the people of the city of Victorville has been lied to and lied to and lied to. Now, I know for a fact some of it is not true at all that we've been told. Now, we need to get something that the people understand exactly where we are. We're way down in the hole. We know we're in the hole, but you guys stand there and tell us we're not. That's not right. The people should know what's going on, and if you can't give them the truth, then keep your mouth shut and don't say nothing. Thank you.
Anyone else? Hearing none, we do have revisions to the agenda.
On the dais is a staff report for item number 3 that's been provided, and there is also a request to add 2 urgency items to the agenda.
Mayor Carvalhalis, in order to add those items, you would need to make a finding pursuant to Government Code 54954.2b2 that there is immediate need to take action on these items, and that the items arose after the posting of the agenda. I have spoken with Mr. McGlade. These are both engineering items. Apparently they are a result of events that occurred from the last set of storms that we had. They pertain to repairs that are required immediately. Sean was only made aware of the extent of the damage to the infrastructure after the posting of the agenda last Friday. And I think it's his opinion that we need to take immediate need in order to start work on these improvements so that we don't, as a result of tonight's storm and possible future storms, create severe problems.
I'll move the findings and the addition based upon the storm, the way it was brewing out there tonight, fast as we can.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Item number 2, the discussion and possible action regarding the mid-year budget review. Mr. Cox?
Mayor and Council, Doug is going to handle this. He and the department heads and the finance department have been working on this very diligently. So he will be responsible for the full presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Cox. Mayor and Council, in the agenda was a fairly detailed report. I've asked the finance staff to put that report into more brief PowerPoint presentation for the benefit of the council and the public, and I will move into that at this time. One thing I need to mention, Mr. Cox asked me to go to the California Municipal Finance Officers Institute in December of last year, and initially I was hesitant to go because of our current financial status, but after returning I was actually thankful that I had gone because of the amount of economic information that was shared at that meeting to give us a really good idea for where we're headed as far as our revenues for the next coming years. So I requested a couple of the speakers send me their slides, and the two gentlemen, well, actually I shouldn't say that. Mr. Schiller was not at the meeting. However, Mr. Jancic, if you note on that slide, used some of Mr. Schiller's data in his presentation, and it, I think, will enlighten you as to how the housing boom affected specifically Victorville's revenues, but revenues throughout the state as well. Not only in property tax, which we now receive as our largest revenue source, but also in sales tax. And rather than come up with my own slides, because I'm not an economist, I was able to get the approval of Mr. Jancic to use his slides in my presentation. So although you may see the Victorville logo at the top, it's just sort of the background. When we get into all the graphs and charts, they are directly from him or from Mr. Schiller, who he referenced in his presentation. The purpose of this is to go through these economic indicators, to take a look at the current financial status, specifically the budget versus actuals, which was prepared last week by Francine Millender, who's in the audience. And just to give credit where credit is due, the report that's in the agenda, although I gave a very small amount of direction, I trusted Francine's judgment and abilities and asked her to put it together, made a few modifications, but in essence, the report that you read is actually mostly her work, and I'd like to thank her at this time for putting that together. The purpose of this is to give you an update as to exactly where we are, and to give the public an update as to exactly where we are, and hopefully to get some input from the council on how to proceed with rectifying our budget problems. It's focused mostly on the general fund. If you read through the report, it is pretty clear to state that the other funds are healthy. Revenues, expenditures are fine in those funds. As you recall, in August, we made a series of cuts to employees' wages, to employee benefits, and included in that a furlough to all the employees, a 10% furlough, essentially every other Friday we were working, now we're off. We are not paid for that time. In the net effect is essentially a 10% pay cut, although it's also a 10% time cut. So we are currently on about a 2-day per month furlough as employees. And Mr. Cox and I have talked, and we don't believe that at this time it would be prudent, when we get to the end of this, to suggest any sort of across-the-board cuts to all employees. We believe that we've already cut salaries and benefits as much as we can. Any more haircuts would result in a fairly significant loss of talent that we just simply can't afford at this time. Let me get right into it. This is one of Mr. Jancic's slides. This is a graph of California's housing prices for the last roughly 10 years and going into the future. However, this isn't an accurate slide. What this represents is housing prices if mortgages were only allowed under the traditional mortgage system without all the crazy financing schemes that were put in place over the last few years. This is the actual numbers, and this takes into account a rise in prices that's attributable to creative financing, such as high loan-to-value loans, such as interest-only loans, and then the teaser rates when they would have a big jump after 5 years. It's also, takes out or includes stated income loans, those sorts of things, lenders selling mortgages that they probably entered into knowing future term were bad mortgages. And unfortunately, this is the other reality as to what happened to those home prices as that whole secondary market and how the housing market crumbled. The prices fell back and now have hit the point of where they probably would have been if it had been conventional only. Based on that, Mr. Jancic's opinion is that we probably have hit bottom and we will start to trend back up. But if you notice his small red dot trend line, we're not going to trend up at nearly the rate that we had been because those mortgages aren't available. So it'll be more of a normalized rate. So some of the economic indicators for Victorville: population growth is still occurring. This is from our own permit activity and from mixed in with the State Department of Finance. We believe that the housing market has stabilized, that prices and absorption have stabilized. We are a little bit afraid of some shadow inventories that are sort of hanging out there. We'd heard of large banks that have not foreclosed on homes that under normal circumstances they would have foreclosed on, and it's yet to be seen what happens when they begin to do that. The possible recovery there listed is 2013. Some of this information is actually also from, I believe, Mr. Husing's opinions on the current economic climate for the Inland Empire as well. This chart is from Mr. Schiller, who's a Yale economist, and let me take a few moments to kind of explain it. The sort of teal or light blue bar there is a normalized price over the last roughly 100 to 120 years, with 100 being sort of a normal cost. You could call that a percentage. That's 1, in essence. That's equal to 1 or $100,000. So in essence, if you had a house that was worth $100,000, or whatever you term 1 to be, a normal cost, in 1890, the low point in 1920 was 66. So a $100,000 house in 1890 was only selling for $66,000 in 1920. You can see as it dips well below that line through World War I, the Great Depression, and into World War II, housing prices were at really an all-time low when normalized for inflation. You can also see the 70s boom in there, the 80s boom, when I know a lot of our developers kind of got started up here through the 70s and 80s booms, and those were good times for both those developers and for Victorville because of how closely our budget is tied to the economy. You're probably curious. This stopped at the 80s boom, really. So what happened in the 2000s in relation to this sort of normalized $100,000 house? That's what happened. Literally, home prices were 5 times. They grew 5 times faster than in the 1980s. The theoretical $100,000 house was worth over $200,000 in 2006. And this is what is collectively referred to as the housing bubble. Mr. Housing Bubble there is, he's happy. He's ready to clean out your life savings and force you into bankruptcy. So we'll leave Mr. Housing Bubble alone. But this is what's happening now. It's coming straight back down. There's a little bit of a projection in there, and we're hopeful that it in fact stops where those red dots stop, and that the housing market has in fact stabilized. I don't think anybody's really going to know definitively for some time now as to whether or not that is the case. Assessed valuation in Victorville, we recently got a letter from the county stating that it had declined 17.7%. We have seen a slight rebound in residential and commercial. Specifically, residential permits in calendar year 2008 were 188 permits, and 2009 it jumped to 260, still well off the 3,000 or so that we saw in the mid-90s, mid to late 90s. Mid to late 2000s. Commercial, we don't measure it based on permits because the commercial permit activity is measured better on assessed value, and 2008 assessed valuation of permits was $25.8 million, and in 2009 was $30.6 million. Sales tax revenues are coming in as budgeted. Our finance staff was diligent in reducing our sales tax estimates based on trend analysis that they had done. And then one thing to keep in mind, the second bullet point there, major bullet point about sales tax continuing a downward trend. Sales tax is reported by the state quarterly, but it's 1 year behind. They don't report current year. They report a year ago. They estimate for a year and then do a sort of a makeup to make up any difference. Slightly different from the house prices, the assessed valuation. They're obviously tied together. But again, this is going back to Mr. Jansik's work, which is based on strictly a normalized mortgage scenario. Throw in the housing bubble, and this was the actual assessed values as they went up and came swiftly back down. One thing to keep in mind is that originally we thought that, well, gosh, okay, that's assessed value, we're a no property tax city. It's not going to affect us a great deal. But in reality, what happened was all of the red that you see there, that was real dollars, based on equity that really wasn't there because of the boom, because of the housing bubble, that was spent on goods. That was spent on SUVs. That was spent on Sea-Doos. That was spent on pools, on permit activity through our development department. So even though we weren't, in those years, we weren't getting property tax, we were getting huge booms in our sales tax because of this false equity, I'll call it. So that's something that we'll have to adjust for into the future. Another issue that just recently came to our attention based on this on the conference that I attended is that our bond issues that were issued in the mid 2000s were based on home prices, based on assessed valuation that was inflated. And some of those bond issues, maybe all of them, have an escalator as to the value of the homes, move on a go-forward basis. And at the time, it seemed prudent to do that. And Mr. Metzler and I were talking today, and we're going to very quickly be looking at those bonds to see where are we exactly with those bonds as far as what the originally anticipated assessed valuation would be, how much of an escalation are we seeing into the future of that, and what do we do to deal with it if, in fact, it's a problem. Keith reassured me a little bit that the reports that he'd seen thus far, most of the rollbacks have been through Prop 8, which is a temporary rollback until the market returns. The question is, when does the market return? So we'll be analyzing that over the next few months.
Before you leave that, recognizing that we need to try to make up that area in red, if you will, with a green proportional amount added on, and it's not there, obviously. And they have the escalator built into that, but we bond at about, what, 70%, so that 30% probably wasn't enough to pick up the difference and hold us not somewhat even with respect to the bank?
At this point, it is, correct me if I'm wrong, Keith, it is barely enough to make up that difference. Okay. But if it continues trending downward, we'll be in a problem.
Right.
I think I would just add to that, and maybe complimenting Mr. Robertson's point. I think recently you were generally familiar with a disclosure report, or at least components from a disclosure report that was related to the bonds that SCLA has issued. And the simplest way to characterize, I think, what Doug is saying is, typically when we have issued bonds, we usually use a 125 X factor or 125 debt service coverage factor. What we're doing effectively is eating into that coverage above and beyond debt service. A 1.0 very basically means you're paying your debt, no more, no less. Just recently, and maybe it was last month, we did our disclosure reporting for the SCLA bonds, and our coverage is 1.07. I think that was disclosed to you. That is the point being, is that we're eating into that coverage requirement. We're paying our debt, but we're just barely paying our debt, and we have very little over and above debt to pay for additional operating expenditures. Okay,
so are the banks putting much pressure on communities at large, not necessarily Victorville, but everybody, to meet that margin again, build that margin when we can't do that? It's right now it's immutable. So are they living with the fact that we don't have a 20-25% margin now, and that's okay because we think later on you'll get okay again, according to them?
I'm not sure if answering the second part of that, saying that it's okay, I'm not sure that's necessarily the right thing to say, because we do have an obligation to at least maintain the coverage. But we're not in default is the point.
What was all the bank bailout business? And I thought that was the whole point of dumping $700 million in. I know it all didn't get there, but the fact is there was an idea. If you put that much infusion into the banking system, it takes the pressure off of what has happened here.
And I'm not necessarily sure that's exactly related to our issues. Our issues are very fundamental. Are you meeting your debt service coverage obligations under the indentures, and are you paying debt? Right now we're paying debt, so we haven't been technically defaulted, and that's actually what's making the banks happy right now, is if you're paying your debt.
Okay.
Keith, that gap needs to, obviously somewhere in the future needs to be filled. But what that tells me right now is that we can go out for bonding if we wanted to.
Today, you're absolutely correct.
It adds probably years to the time that we would be able to go out for a bond again, because we would need to meet that debt service coverage for whatever bond that we would go out for. Continuing the dreary news, unfortunately, on this dreary evening as it's getting outside. This is not unfamiliar at all. We've been on a downward trend in revenue since 2008, probably since 2007 in some of the revenue sources. As has always been the case, although it used to be more sales tax than property tax, our over 70%, or roughly 70% of our revenue is tied to the economy. So to the extent the economy is bad, the city's budget is going to be bad from the general fund standpoint. That's just a fact of life because of the way the city's built and the way the city's financed. So revised revenue projections, this takes into account a couple of factors. Number one, I mentioned earlier that our sales tax numbers are coming in about where we expected. And I appreciate the hard work that went into making those projections. The in lieu sales tax, this was actually covered somewhat in detail a few months ago to a memo to the council. The way this works is part of the triple flip, or the triple flip that the state passed several elections ago now, includes taking 25% of the city's sales tax and coloring that money a different color and calling it state money, and then replenishing it with other monies from the state. It was an attempt to get financing, which they were able to do. It comes back to us based on estimates on an annual basis. Unfortunately for us, the state overestimated our sales tax last year, our sales tax in lieu last year. They didn't adjust for the economy in time the way we had. And so we got a notice shortly after passing our budget that kept those revenues flat in the budget, that they had in fact overpaid us to the tune of about $900,000, just over $900,000 for the 09 year. Included in that letter was them letting us know that because of that, they would be taking that money out of the fiscal year 2010 payments that they would give us. So in essence, they both revised down by $900,000, their estimate, and took last year's revision at the same time, meaning that we got a double hit this year. I'm hopeful, Francine is slightly less hopeful, maybe a lot less hopeful, that the state is a little closer on their estimate this year and that we won't have a similar issue next year. So in theory, the $2.6 million that we're expecting to receive hopefully will rise. If Francine's right, and she probably is, then it won't rise. It'll stay about the same or maybe even get worse. So we'll see. I'm not confident enough to bet her on it, though.
Doug, have we done our own due diligence to conclude whether they're $900,000 accurate, or is it just some bureaucrat in Sacramento saying this is the error?
That's a good point. I don't know that we can until they actually true up in a year. Their sales tax revenues are estimated to us quarterly, and they're a full year behind. So until they actually true it up, I don't know that we'll be able to make that clean determination one way or the other.
So they have the statutory authority to just arbitrarily say, without foundation or evidence, we, meaning the state, made an error, and although we can't prove this number, we're going to take it and whistle Dixie until sometime in the future the evidence is made available.
I don't want to necessarily confirm that, but I certainly wouldn't deny it. So, in fact, one of the points that I'll get to here is that the state is actually projecting an increase in their sales tax for either this year or next year. I'm not sure which. So, to the extent that the state has engaged historically in overinflating their revenues in order to pass a budget, we always hear about the get-out-of-town budgets. Perhaps, I'm not accusing them of this, but perhaps some of this has to do with the fact that they've got to maintain some similarities between their sales tax estimates. So if they overestimate sales tax in order to balance, if you can call it that, the state budget, then I suppose they would have to use those same projections on the rest of their data. Otherwise, it creates a bit of a conflict amongst their documents coming out of those state departments. The property tax, although we got the notice that it was down 17.7%, because we had already budgeted a drop in that property tax, we don't have as big a hit. So that hit is about 5%, or just under $1 million. Moving along, I don't want to read every word to you. The general fund generally is doing fairly well on an overall basis. Considering the amount that was cut just a few months ago from the general fund, I've been impressed that the departments overall have been staying on target with regarding their budgets. As I mentioned earlier, other funds are within reasonable tolerances, as Francine has put it. There are a few problem areas that we have identified. Those are listed here. They're also in the report in a little bit greater detail. I'll speak to the very first one, which is the city attorney budget. The city attorney budget is not something that Andre comes up with. He doesn't even know what's budgeted. This is purely a city function, and it actually has not. The budget amount hasn't changed in probably 5 years. A little bit of a look into the processes that we go through in order to pay our bills sometimes. The city attorney bill comes in, and because that bill is sort of farmed out to every department to code as to their proper codes, so that code enforcement cases are paid from code enforcement, which is part of development, and planning cases aren't paid from code enforcement dollars, and such and so forth. That process takes a little bit of time, and in order to pay those bills on time, we pay the bill when it comes in, and then send it to departments, and they code those so that they come out of the proper accounts. So to a certain degree, this $250,000 budget is sort of in a holding point on a fairly regular basis, and then a lot of that money comes out. So it's been, be honest and upfront, somewhat ignored as far as a budgeted figure, because a lot of the money should come out and go to other departments, to projects and things like that. Unfortunately, because of our situation with a couple of lawsuits, this budget needs to be increased because those costs aren't necessarily attributable to a project that has funding right now or to a department that has funding right now. It's simply a citywide issue. So we'll be coming back to you with a request for increase, but we wanted to have full disclosure on that. The engineering piece in there, engineering over the last couple of years has worked very diligently to take several $1 million off of the general fund and put into projects so that they could keep their engineers busy on those projects, and everything is charged appropriately. There are still general fund dollars that have to be expended by engineering. And I don't want to speak for Sean because I know he's prepared to address this should the council have any questions. But one issue that I'll say we collectively discovered this year and hadn't thought about when preparing Sean's budget is that vacation time, sick time, severance pay for employees who are laid off or retire, you can't charge that to a project. So if I'm charging 100% of engineer X's time to a project, when that engineer goes on vacation, it's inappropriate to charge the vacation time to the project because the project doesn't take vacations. So ultimately vacation time and some of those other times are paid. So we are going to make adjustments this year and into next year to better project the engineering budget. I don't know, Sean, if you have anything you want to add in reviewing your budget.
Maybe I just should add a few more points to that. As Doug mentioned, some of the charges that were unexpected, just severance packages as people were laid off. There was a severance amount paid to those individuals, and in total the engineering department had 6 full-time people laid off and 4 part-time. Those are one-time charges for that event. You know, in the event there are more layoffs, that's going to occur again. But that was never included in the budget at all. And just another thing that I think it's important for the council to understand in the development activities of the 2006-2007 era, there were permits for the construction of the public improvements for these tracts, many of them. And you'll have seen on the City Council agenda, in the consent calendar, but in the first half of the year there were 17 items dealing with bond reductions. Each bond reduction required staff effort. Typically a public works inspector will be out there 2 times, and then there's all of the paperwork to be prepared to take it to City Council for that reduction. Today we are collecting no money for that. That money to pay for that effort was collected at the time the permit was issued. Some of these permits were issued 6 years ago. When we total up those 17 tracts, those projects, we collected $467,000 towards our effort, but it was collected up to 6 years ago. So, you know, some of that activity is having to come straight out of general fund with no revenue to directly pay for that. However, we did see a much higher revenue from inspection fees coming in. We projected 50,000 for the year, and there's 145,000 in the first 6 months. So there's, you know, at least a little better picture on the revenue side. Kim.
Some of the other items that the council should be aware of attached to the report is a list of all of our accounts and their current status. The council will be reviewing that and see something that looks like it's a problem. Keep in mind that 2 things. Number one, some of the projects funds are expended all in the first 6 months, and then there's no expenditure in the second 6 months of the year. So to see something that's at 100%, it could be well and good that we intended it to be at 100% at this time. It's not a monthly issue that is going to be a problem. And then the other thing to keep in mind is that some of the projections or some of the dollar amounts right now will be weighted a little bit heavier on the first 6 months, simply because when we had the staff reductions and when we had benefit changes, a lot of that took place 2 months into the fiscal year. So you essentially have 4 months of new wages and 2 months of full wages and full strength on the number of employees we've got. So it's not always easy to compare the first half of the year with the second half of the year. So if you total those 2 things together, the general fund anticipated revenue shortfall at the end of the year, the general fund anticipated expenditures at the end of the year, if no action is taken, then you see a projected gap of about $4.3 million. Although we don't typically respond to public comment, and I don't want to respond directly to public comment necessarily. When Mrs. Miller asked or made the statement, we're way down in the hole, I suppose that $4.3 million is way down. And she wanted to know how far down. I think that's fairly specific as to how far down we likely will be come June 30th, should we not address the issue. Now, addressing the issue is another interesting question. At the end, yes, sir.
Before we go to that next step, I realize that we're talking about a general fund gap. Fresh for me, what is the total budget for the city?
I am going to look into the audience and hope someone has a number, and Francine is flipping rather quickly. It's not a number that I typically keep in my head.
I think it's in the range of about 500 million, but I don't know that.
353 million. Right. And one thing that I want you to keep in mind is that we are asking for input from the council. I think the council has been very clear in the past on giving direction to staff as far as what projects to pursue. Unfortunately, we aren't at a point that we can pursue those projects. So now we're asking for some input, guidance on what priorities the council has that you want to maintain, what priorities, what projects perhaps, what divisions that you would like to see us take a look at making some cuts to. But I want to reassure you that if no cuts are made tonight, we can make it through the end of this fiscal year with a gap of $4.3 million. We have enough fund balance in the general fund. It's not budgeted reserves, but there is enough fund balance, and you'll hear a little bit about that in a week when the audit is presented, to cover that dollar amount. But that would be essentially a structural deficit on a go-forward basis, and we want to address it before moving into the 2010-2011 fiscal year. So in a little bit of a twist on a mid-year budget, our purpose isn't necessarily going to try to get us back to zero by June 30, 2010, because in order to do that, we'd have to make the equivalent of probably a $12 million annual cut. We can't afford to do that. We don't want to do that. So what we would want to do over the next month to 2 months is work on a plan to get that projected gap for 2010-2011 to be zero, or as close to zero as we can get it. So, and I'll touch on that in just a moment again. The economic forecast, as I've been saying, is still guarded. We do expect, we hope that it doesn't happen, we do expect to see some of our revenue sources to still further decline, and that's our intent as we head into 2010-11 fiscal year, is to project that way. Unless something happens over the next couple of months that changes our mind, we don't want to be back in front of you in 12 months saying we need to cut some more. We'd like to try to get it right as quickly as we can so that we can begin to build that sort of foundation for the recovery when that happens to start occurring. But we want to be ready for that. As I mentioned, we're going to probably project that property tax and sales tax will be down. The state is actually going to project, or projecting, an 8% increase in their sales tax. So it's a little troubling. Our projection is actually a 6% decrease in sales tax based on the lineal analysis that Francine performed. So we've kind of walked through most of those slides from Mr. Jancic, and there's just a couple of more from him that I want to go over so that it's clear. A lot of folks are looking to buy into the housing market thinking, I'm assuming, thinking that it's going to come back, and it's going to come back strong, and they're going to get rich in a fairly short order. Mr. Jancic would disagree with that strongly, I'll say. He essentially said that the tendency is to look back in time at I shoulda, coulda, woulda, coulda, shoulda. If I'd have bought Google in 1990 whatever, or if I'd have bought Coca-Cola in 1952, or if I'd have bought Microsoft in 1977 or whenever it was, look where I would have been. So the thought is, well, gosh, if I'd have bought housing, if I'd have bought enough homes in 2002 or 2003 and sold them, and I was smart enough to sell them in 2006, I'd be rich right now. So let me try to do that now because the prices are back down there. Well, unless you think that, in fact, we're going to go back to those predatory lending schemes, unless you think that, in fact, the housing is going to come back that quickly, Mr. Jancic would advise against it. The key, he says, is to not look back. Don't look at the red arrow, looking back at what was or what might have been, but try to look forward at a reasonable projection based on conventional mortgages moving into the future, and base your decisions on slow, steady growth over the next several years, and ignore those bubbles of the past. Try to start off with a new baseline, put the blinders on as to the future, and try to move forward.
Doug?
Yes.
I certainly wouldn't disagree with that, but I think the reality is there's nothing that we as 5 elected officials can do to influence that equation. I mean, that is going to be certainly a statewide policy issue. It has to do with the very nature of people in terms of the decisions they make, but I wouldn't want anybody to get the impression that somehow there's a process or a public policy debate that we could engage in that would have any impact on the equation.
Absolutely not. You will have no impact on that equation. Well, what you will have an impact on is that as we move forward, with a new baseline starting hopefully today or, over the last couple of months, with a go-forward attitude about where our revenues are going to be for the next year, 2, 3, 4 years. It was a very exciting time over the last 5 years, but unfortunately, at least this economist is saying not to ever expect those times to return. This is just sort of a summary slide, and everything that I've mentioned earlier. The $3.4 million gap, I'm accounting for the state correcting that estimate, and I hope I'm right. But if not, you could expect that to grow a little bit. So at this point, unless Mr. Cox has anything to add, I'd like to open it up for any input from the council on areas to focus on as we look to trim. One thing I did fail to mention, something that I just got in my email almost as I was walking into this meeting, and that is that the state is actually projecting the state controller is projecting to be in the red, out of cash, April 1st of this year. So what exactly they do to mitigate that and what effect that has on cities is yet to be seen. Last year, when they were faced with a similar situation, they didn't take any money from us. They just said that they were going to wait for payment on some of our gas tax funds and I believe HUDA and they sort of collected up 4, 5, 6 months worth and then paid us in the following fiscal year, which helped them, didn't help us a whole lot, and certainly created a bit of a cash flow issue, pushed their cash flow issue down to us.
Mayor and Council, the only thing I'd like to add is to thank Doug Robertson, the staff, Finance Department, department heads. For several months now, we have been indicating that we're saving where we can. We're doing a lot of things. We're also trying to figure out exactly where we will be. Anytime a city gets to the point that it's going to have to potentially reduce services, you're going to come under a lot of criticism. I'd like to go to the basics just for a second. You're required to have zoning, and you are required to allow individuals to develop their land. Otherwise, you have a taking of land if an individual wants to develop, where it's an individual who has purchased land and now want to build a home, or if they want to build a tract of homes. There's not within your authority to simply say you're not going to allow building. Now, whether or not that becomes extremely successful or you have vacancies is beyond your control, because you are not a participant financially in that, and you had lending institutions and banks that were making it easy for individuals to qualify for loans, and the suspicion is that a lot of individuals who purchased those homes should not have qualified for those loans, and there was a demand that the industry was meeting, and this required the municipality also to meet the demands for those individuals, such as expanded parks and other public infrastructure improvements, as well as capital improvements, as well as the location of fire stations and an expanded police force. Most people don't realize that those issues are totally beyond your control. The only thing you do control is the level of service that you provide. And during this period of not only a lot of building, but during the period of, I would call a partial collapse, we have maintained the public services as best as we could, and with the council's absolute direction that there be no reduction in the safety areas of police and fire. We've also had all departments to recognize that they have to keep the services going, and even though we have 84 or less employees, 80, whatever the number that 83, 84 employees that we had a year ago, we've tried to maintain the services, and we're at the point now, as Doug indicated, because of the savings and because we're selling assets, because we're turning in vehicles, because we are out for bids on our golf courses, we actually can get through June 30 as we're going but we could not possibly get through next year if we did that. So we have to make sure that we don't run into those problems, and we have to make those cuts now. And we have to think about that it probably will, well, I absolutely believe at this point that there will be a further reduction in staff, and layoffs are going to come rather quickly. And secondly, you have to recognize the fact there's probably going to be a reduction in services. One of the things that I think the reality is that you may have to look at public safety. No one wants to suggest that. No one wants to telegraph that. No one wants to go there. And we have had contracts with county fire, county police, sheriff's department that have just been remarkable in that they have been able to make do and not reduce that level of service. And we're going to try to keep that level of service by getting grants or wherever we can find funding to do so. But the reality is that they're stretched thin also. And we got to recognize the reality of life is that we're probably going to reduce services in some areas. Now, I'm going to throw out a couple of things that they aren't really tongue-in-cheek, but I did, in fact, get a call from an individual demanding that we close the golf course immediately because it's losing money, and when you have a plot of land losing money, you need to close it. And I suggested that if that was really true, we would close all the parks. You can't believe how much money the parks are losing. The individual said, well, that's ridiculous. He uses the parks, but he doesn't use the golf course. And I said, well, it's ridiculous because I use the golf course, but I don't use the parks. How do you please the individuals who want their services met, but they don't care if the neighbor across the street gets their services met or not? And that is the very difficult position that staff is in and that the council is in. And so we as I said about 3 months ago, we recognize the financial problems that we're in. We hear the council. We hear you clearly. And staff is cooperating to the fullest extent that we possibly can to make this work. We are going to make it work. It's taking longer than what we expected. We don't see the turnaround that we were hoping that would come. But the reality on the housing market, even though we think we've reached the bottom and bouncing back, all of those loans were made available by lending institutions and banks. You have no control over that. And the reason that's not going to happen again is because of the federal regulations that's tied directly to the bailout. And the economists who look at this are absolutely certain that the banks can never go back to what they were doing a couple of years ago. But that also means that the very high inflated market value of the homes is not going to go there, and so you are not going to have the property tax. You are not going to have the redevelopment funds that you had. And so what you're going to see is houses selling less, being filled possibly with individuals with a lot of government subsistence, which means they do not have disposable income. Therefore, you have the rooftops, but you don't have disposable income to help the sales. And as you well know, sales tax to the city is extremely important, has been, and will continue to work on that. But I want to thank Doug for the presentation. A lot of work went into this. We do not make the assumptions, however, from a staff point of view, what the policy issues that are facing the council. We know you'll want to discuss those. We know you'll need some time, and after this presentation, even though you have questions, we're prepared to answer those. There are some reports that we're going to be coming back that more finalize and the dollar amounts and what it appears to be large expenditures and how we can cut those. But we need some direction from the council, because you have to talk about the services that you want to keep and the services that we can reduce. In regard to the city attorney's budget, I did get a call about why don't we have an in-house attorney, so on. One of the things that you cannot avoid and you have no control over, when I was talking about that, is litigation. And when you get sued, you must defend or you lose. And even though we have a large budget, we have to sometimes retain attorneys that aren't even located here. We had two recent bankruptcy cases, one in Arizona, one in Texas. We had to retain attorneys through the city attorney's office to protect the city in those instances. They were large dollar amounts, but they weren't expenditures that went to the city attorneys. They were approved by the council. You cannot avoid when those things happen. So if somebody decides to sue the city, And we have other attorneys that are specialists, and we use those other than the city attorney's office. They're often billed through the city attorney's office because that's the role, but they don't necessarily are paid to that individual. When the number came out, it became obvious that we need to get a more exact report to the council in regard to where all those fees are going and who they have been paid to and why. But in many, many instances, you simply have no control over those. So I have nothing more at this time. If you have questions, we'll do our best to answer.
I have no questions at the appropriate time. I have some comments.
Just a question. I know that, or are we formally out on an RFP for the golf courses, number one, and there's been discussion of doing somewhat of the same thing on our parks. Can you speak to the number of employees that would involve and what kind of savings we could potentially see there, or is there any?
John, Mindy, no, we talked today about the numbers that went out and the interest that we have. Do you have any information on that you can report?
John Mendiola, could you just come up to the podium
Please.
just to respond to that so we get it on?
I'm sorry, I saw you earlier, but I didn't see you, so I didn't see you right away.
We have our first ad in the County Sun coming out on Saturday on the 13th. Second ad in the Daily Press on the 20th. We'll have a pre-proposal meeting over at Green Tree, to tour Green Tree and West Winds on February 26th on Monday at 9 a.m. And we have on our bid list currently about 36 firms and individuals that have requested interest in looking at what our proposal is all about. And they're throughout the whole nation.
Okay. And to the number of employees at the golf courses, as well as can we speak to the parks, and is the parks also being considered for the same sort of RFP? I know that has informally been discussed, but
yeah, not at this time. We had individuals when we talked about the RFPs for the individuals for the golf course, and there's several options in regard to maintenance only to full operations. And two of those firms that expressed an interest, one of those firms currently contracts for at least two cities that they named to also provide maintenance in the parks. And they wanted to know if that option would be available. And we said to them that we are going to look at that. We hadn't thought about it, but it might be another area that we need to look at. One other item, just for the council, we indicated that we went out for RFPs for Foxborough for the equipment. We had offers, and we had been selling some of the equipment that we felt we had good negotiated value. We received a call from an individual that said they didn't know it was available, otherwise they would have bid, and so we stopped the whole process. We went out and covered much area as Amr, you may want to speak about this. We covered as much area as we could. The closing date on that was 2 o'clock today. For any and all individuals who expressed an interest on buying any equipment, and I believe the response was fairly dismal.
We did not receive any response on the RFPs for Foxborough, and the idea was to put it out there and let somebody else look at it, come up with any solution that they can come up with. At this point, we'll be moving forward with looking at the options that we have available. One of them is sale of the equipment, and we'll be bringing forward an item to council, maybe next council meeting, to address that.
We've made every attempt to get interest on this, but now we're back to direct negotiations. While verbally they're indicated there was a lot of interest, when it came right down to it, it wasn't there. There are a lot of people who have read about the financial problems of Victorville and believe there's a fire sale, and they can rush in and get something for nothing. And we're hoping that the golf course does not fall into that same category. A lot of interest, but when it gets down to submitting that data for the council to decide which way to go, we'll not be surprised to see many individuals fall along the way. We've had some inquiries from individuals who operate golf courses. The first question is, how much are you willing to pay us to take the golf course? And there's a lot of negotiations going on. Now, we do know on a lot of the equipment at Foxborough, we have some overseas interest, but we have individuals we're going to negotiate with now. We may end up in regard to maintenance of the golf course, negotiating. We hope not. We hope we'll get good proposals, and we may end up the same way, but we're not going to leave any stone unturned, but it might not happen as quickly as we would like it. We're moving as quickly as possible, but we cannot force individuals to submit bids, and we're doing everything we can to indicate that we're very open to any proposal that someone wants to make.
I have a question. The expenditure for the golf course, that's part of the deficit, that shortfall?
I'm sorry, Mr. Mayor,
About 1.5 million?
yes, there is, part of that deficit would be attributable to the amount that the general fund contributes to the golf course fund each year. Yes.
The other part is from the regular taxes that are collected, or?
The other part of...
Or the revenues?
Of the revenues, right. That's from mostly the in lieu sales tax as well as property taxes. Right, right. That's part of the overall city.
Comments?
Well, the first comment I'm going to make isn't focused on the budget or the mid-year budget review. It's in response to some comments that Mr. Cox made just a few minutes ago about our inability to influence the decisions of the marketplace when it comes to housing, whether it's a single-family project or a major subdivision. And I agree completely with what Mr. Cox said. I just want to add, for purposes of the record, I guess, that in addition to us not having any control over that, a big chunk of the bubble we saw on the charts and the graphs are a direct result of federal intervention in the banking process. I'm speaking now as a former director and the vice chairman of a bank. Fortunately, that federal intervention litigation or legislation is still on the books. And to the extent that things continue the way they are, I am concerned that there will be a return to that government intervention known as the Community Reinvestment Act. Community Reinvestment Act, in my opinion, is a major factor in the housing bubble. Every bank in this country was issued criteria and bogeys to meet in terms of lending to people who would not qualify. I sat in loan committee meetings month in and month out where we were forced by federal regs to make loans to people that we knew as lenders they could not afford and could not pay. So the glut of foreclosures in this community is influenced heavily, as it is in every other community, by a rule imposed Community Reinvestment Act to seek out unqualified applicants and make loans that, from a banker's perspective, there was never any reasonable commercial expectation that they would ever be paid. And I think all of us need to be vigilant, watch that, and to make sure that our federal elected officials don't get again involved in that kind of a program. But it's still on the books, and I'm very, very concerned that that could be revisited and have a major impact on this housing bubble issue. But back to the budget presentation tonight. I've already said this to a couple people. I want to say it again. I went rushing into Doug's office the other day after I read this report. I wanted to shake his hand and tell him what a fantastic job he did, because I think the report was clear, it was concise, and it painted the right picture that we as the decision makers had to have. But he quickly told me that while he appreciated the comments, it wasn't his work product, it was Francine's. So I just want everybody to know that not only did you do a great job, but Doug gave her the credit for it. And it really is a great job. It makes it much easier to understand this whole process. In spite of what we all feel individually, because we're suffering through it as the 5 elected officials. The reality is Victorville's situation, what we're confronted with, is being experienced by just about every city in this county and in Southern California and across the nation. And there are people, some in this room, who would like to paint the picture that somehow Victorville is uniquely bad, and the fact is that's not true. We have financial problems, as does every other city. All you got to do is read the papers to see that multiple cities in this county are struggling through exactly what we're going through. Read the paper, Los Angeles is talking about laying off 1,000 people. I don't say that to sugarcoat the situation that we're in, but I think that we have an obligation to respond to the criticisms that somehow we screwed things up by pointing out that we don't have any control over declining revenues. If people don't go to the stores, if they don't buy cars, they don't purchase new homes, then the sales tax, the property tax, the subventions, the in-lieu, all of those revenue streams decline. And while we have the obligation to tighten our belt and figure out how we deal with the decline in revenues, it's not something that we directly control. Worse yet, we have no way to avoid the raid on subventions. I'm not sure, maybe there's somebody in the audience who could tell us the order of magnitude of the amount of grab from Sacramento on our subventions. I think it's something above $4 million, but if somebody can quantify that, I'd like to know what that number is. My feeling is that the obligation of this council in terms of the budgetary issues needs to stay focused on job creation. Somebody gets a job, they're likely to buy a house, even if it's one coming out of foreclosure. They've got a paycheck, they're going to go to the market, they might buy a car. I think that the one thing that's under our control that doesn't cost us a lot of money is to continue our effort on job creation. Not just at George Air Force Base or SCLA and Foxborough, but throughout the city. Quality of life for most people, the primary judge of that is if they got a job. We can talk about parks and golf courses and everything else that makes up a community, but best indicator of health, financial health, is the ability to pay your bills, send your kids off to college. So I hope as we move to restructure in whatever way, and as we move to tighten our belt in whatever way, that we not lose our drive and our commitment to create jobs, because all of the other things we do are temporary, and we've got to readdress them each budget year. But for every job you create, you're creating a stream of wealth, much of which will flow to the general economic welfare of the community, and when that happens, the city's resources will improve. So that's really all I have to say. I guess I would add one other thing. If we get somebody to take a foreclosure in one fashion or another, those values, those assessed values associated with that property will go up a little. You know, as they start replanting the lawns and repairing the dilapidations, the assessed values will go up, and from that will come increased property tax revenues. So I know that Keith has programs designed to work around some of the foreclosure issues. I hope we don't gut that program. I know we have programs for assisting people to acquire properties. Hope that we continue with that program. But that's my contribution to the discussion tonight. I'm not prepared to recommend any specific programs to be cut or to be reduced, but in fact we'll discuss that within the next week or two in more. I have confidence in the staff. You've steered this ship for the last many, many months, as painful as it has been to do the things you've had to do. Don't envy those decisions, the layoffs, the cuts, the restructuring, but I think you've done a great job thus far. I applaud you for the effort that you've put into it, and I have confidence that work through this for the next couple of weeks. We'll come up with something we all may not be happy about, but we will recognize as being the right thing for the city.
Trouble to answer your question on the roughly $4 million. That is an accurate number. This summer, the state essentially exercised the emergency provisions in Prop 1A that was passed to protect our funds, and as such borrowed for a 3-year period a portion of our property tax. We were rescued, however, because, and I don't know if the state was bright enough to get this put in place ahead of time, but some bondholders or some financiers recognized that the state had to repay that money by law within 3 years, and that there was a certain percentage there that they would have to add on to the top of that. So the state actually sold bonds on individual city-by-city, county-by-county basis, so that they're technically not state bonds, they're actually city bonds that were all lumped together. And those of us that participated in it we actually received some of that funding that the state would have taken, actually did take. We received it from the bond proceeds of that in January, and then we'll receive the other piece of that in May. So in essence, it's a wash. Over the 3-year period, we would have lost, or this year we would have lost $2.9 million, I believe was the figure. And would have got that back in 3 years. So in essence, what happens is we get the bond proceeds in that exact amount, that $2.9 million roughly. And then when we're paid back the $2.9 million that the state borrowed, it goes directly to those bondholders with that percent increase to it. So they're making a little bit of money. So although that was scary for a few weeks because that option popped up, it didn't hurt us as bad as what we originally anticipated.
Instead of getting both arms cut off, we only got one arm cut off.
That's an accurate statement, yes.
Just to add on to a few things that Terry has talked about, I do remember when this housing crunch began to tank, and I think it was Ron Wilson had told me one time, I said, a good conservative bank, DCB, in a nice area like this, how could you guys be putting those loans out there? And he says the federal bank regulators were in their face, Terry's face, and everybody else's face, every quarter asking how many loans, subprime loans and others that you're in. And if you didn't do that, the feds would step in and punish you. So even if you had a bank that had an inclination not to participate in this, they couldn't. They were forced to do it anyway. So as you look at that national landscape, at least out there, and look at those folks in Congress and everything else and what is being proposed, just remind yourself that the Fannie Mae and Freddie Macs and all of that stuff comes right down here onto the table, sitting here at these city councils, and that assessed valuation that we've lost here in the city of Victorville, no small part of that 40% bubble that you saw on that graph comes out of those decisions that were forced upon us when people couldn't afford that. You and I, almost all of us, put our 10 or 20% up, moved in, made our house payments, and went about our business of living in a house that we could afford. And all of those new houses, that huge amount of houses that were being built in the last 3, 4, 5 years, those folks, a good part, 40% of those folks couldn't afford those homes. No fault of the individual living in the home, but a big fault of the federal government and those folks imposing that on us. The other thing is that, and this is only a guesstimation on my part, I'm hoping that the retail as a product of any community has a floor someplace. There are those durable goods that you kind of, like the houses and the cars, that people put off, and you discount that for a moment. Look at the rest of the general retail out there. Probably we're hitting our floor in that, and hopefully that the next year of sales tax and those type of things, we'll see that reasonable growth off of that floor, and not be way up there in the skies, because obviously those folks aren't buying cars, but pretty soon they're going to have to, because they put off the ideas of their washing machines and the big products that do generate the larger sales tax increments. Those type of things. I think that's exciting to come back. And the third thing I want to put in is an optimistic thing, and that's kind of what my tenor is trying to be, is to be after, with all the negative here, what do we have going on a going forward basis? There's platforms out there right now of growth that wouldn't have been there had we not been working in those areas. Rubbermaid comes to mind out there. That's a 400,000 square foot building. They've got options to make a 1 million square foot building, moving some white collar work and other things up here. And that option is still on the table and something that those folks are looking at. And there's other, the Dr. Pepper and the plastic company are there 400 jobs on the table now. There's people looking right in behind that type of activity because they're there now, and we were able to offer that incentive for them to be there. Those jobs will begin to build other jobs behind them. So that platform is there. That SCLA, we wouldn't have wished the closure on us, but here we are at the back end of a very bad time. And right now that platform for growth, for job production is good. I think I said it a year ago, and I'm saying it again right now, that I think that the Victor Valley, and certainly SCLA, is probably going to be one of the fastest growing off of this base of job production that you're going to find in all of Southern California. So we have to deal with today. We have to deal with this budget. Now we're $4 million short, and that's going to be painful. And it would be irresponsible for this council or any council not to deal with that $4 million and make the proper adjustments. But that's what we have to do at the local level. The state and the federal government, evidently, they don't feel they have to do that, or the state wouldn't be in debt $20 billion and climbing, and the federal government wouldn't be $13 trillion in debt and climbing. They would have been spending at some reasonable amount. So with that, I'm like Terry said, we're no different than any other city. We've got a few numbers a little bit bigger than others because we've got bigger projects and bigger activities in the past, and we'll deal with them. So with that, we have a very professional council. We have a very professional staff, and I feel very confident that we're going to come out of this next year shade better than we're looking at right now.
Well, thanks. I too want to thank Francine for putting together this report. It's very concise, very detailed, and does clearly provide the council with a true picture of reality and what we're facing here. And I do agree that the council and the city should continue to focus on job creation. It's just a little bit difficult to talk about that in light of the fact that we're getting ready to have to tell more people that they're going to lose their jobs. You know, I wish we could be creating jobs that they could go into. And, you know, perhaps there's still some possibility that some of the folks that have been laid off or potentially could be laid off could secure employment at Dr. Pepper, Snapple, or the Plastipack bottling facility. That would be my hope. But in light of what we're faced with here, you know, I think our city manager and our staff are professional enough to know what they need to do. I'm going to stand adamant behind not cutting public safety. To me, that is only last resort, in my opinion. Sure, it would be nice to cut the city attorney's budget some, but I do understand the reasons for that. I just think we need to look at everything. I focused on the golf courses and the parks. You know, to me, outsourcing maintenance of those facilities, I see a tremendous possibility of savings to the city there on an annual basis, and it needs to be explored. Perhaps there are other areas that we can outsource that we haven't explored yet, and I would encourage our city staff to look at that. But you know, from my perspective, the reality is not good. I don't like looking at this, and we need to deal with it. And I'm sure that our city staff will do everything in their power to deal with it. But I will stand 100% committed to public safety, and I do not want to see us cut that at all.
Thank you, Ryan. I would also like to thank our staff for an excellent report It's very, like Terry says, precise, it's clear, you can understand it. And it's tough sitting here once again contemplating cuts. In August, we went through this agony. And I call it agony because it is. And it's, you know, we're support the job creation and all those things at the at SCLA, and it's going real good out there. But also when you have to cut from your own family, your city family, it's kind of tough to kind of see the both sides. But I do support job creation, support our fire and police department, and I again would also echo Ryan's comments that that would be my preference for the last resort to deal with that. But I think staff has outlined their last drawing up there, video up there, showed kind of the steps, you know, financial responsibility, and we need to maintain that. We need to deal with the 4-point plus deficit. We need to deal with the projected deficit for the following year, which will be 3.something million, and then we need to bring it in line the third year. So I think that's the roadmap that we have to follow. Again, staff, we always leave all the tough work for staff. We, of course, we make the final decisions, but I'm sure the staff will come back with some of the suggestions that the other council members have indicated. Outsourcing, there may be some programs that we might be able to cut, but you know, the hardest thing is laying off employees, and so I would hope that we went through that one time, but maybe we can do other things before we can get to that point. Thank you. I do have a card from Norm Miller.
Council members, I have a couple questions, I think. One is there anything in the budget for eucalyptus?
Norm, this is a midterm review. We're
Yes.
just looking at what the expenditures and revenues are up to this point, so we can carry on. I guess you would have to ask. The answer is no.
Asking. And if I can't ask any other questions like that, then I'd like to know if the Public Works Director has any time after the meeting. I'd like to see him for a minute.
Right there, right behind you. Thank you. We'll now move on to item number 3, the request to approve an amendment number 1 to the wastewater capacity agreement. We do have additional information that was submitted to us for that.
Mr. Mayor and members of the council, maybe to just give the Cliff Note version of the item that's before you. Staff is recommending that you go ahead and approve this first amendment to the wastewater capacity agreement, which actually facilitates interim discharge of wastewater to help accommodate the initial startup operations for the Dr. Pepper project. At the last council meeting, you'll recall that you did approve an agreement which is a first step in accommodating Dr. Pepper's early operation. But that agreement was basically an agreement that enabled us as the city to send flows to VWD from Dr. Pepper on an interim basis. And I believe the term on that agreement was for a term not to exceed 8 months. Definitely don't expect to even come close to eating up all of that time. We're currently on schedule to get our plant operational by the mandated June 17th target date. With that, this agreement before you very generally allows for us to recapture the costs that we would otherwise incur by sending, pursuant to the agreement previously approved by this council, to VWD. We can recapture those costs, the treatment costs, from Dr. Pepper, along with any additional cost associated with our physical and human transfer between pipes to get the actual flows to the VWD plant.
There is a request to approve the amendment.
I'll move approval of the First Amendment to the wastewater capacity and treatment agreement.
Second.
Before we go into closed session, we do have the two urgency items. How do we number these? 3A and 3B, or?
If the council could just take a voice vote, we don't have the items
Okay.
numbered.
We have urgency item number 1. It's a request to award a contract to DDH Apple Valley Construction in the amount of $197,585.
Approval?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Item number 2 is the written communications, the request to award contract to VCI Telecom, Inc. in the amount of $97,857.35.
Move for approval.
Second?
Aye.
Aye.
Now we have the closed session.
Mayor Cabrialis, pursuant to Government Code 54956.9B2, we are at a point where we believe there's exposure to litigation. Specifically, we were in contract, as you're aware, with General Electric. That contract by General Electric has been deemed that we have breached that contract. As such, we believe that their next course of action may be litigation. I need to brief you as to what our options are and how to respond to hopefully avoid such a situation.
We'll move into closed session.
I thought so.
The result of this evening's closed session, which was agendized, there is no reportable action.